Welcome to another episode of Power Core Productions and Podcastings. I'm your host, Javon Harrington, back to hit you another video, and today we're going to be continuing What If Deku Was a Power Ranger? Heroes of the Morphing Grid series, part 11. Now, for those of you who are unaware, we are now entering into season 5 of My Hero Academia for this portion of the story. Now, originally I was going to do the movies, but however, it did come to my attention recently that maybe one or two of the movies that have come out recently might not be canon to the story. And while I don't mind adding the movies for the sake of doing so, at the very least, I'm told that if the movies do take place, they take place after season 5. So I want to cover season 5 first as a whole. And then after I do that, then we'll be getting into the movies as well. There's also another thing that I want to talk about recently, and that is the Villain Hero Academia portion of the story. And that is if you guys want me to cover that portion in this story, simply because the heroes aren't involved in particular at that point in time. So, you know, outside of anything that the heroes might do, then you might not even need to cover that portion anyway, as that's pretty much just the villain side. So once you've seen that, then there's not really much else to do. I mean, I can go into part 12 that would cover their time at the Endeavor Hero Agency, but that would be about it. So if you still want to cover the Villain Hero Academia portion of the story, then we can do that if you want. But if you're content with just following the heroes for this portion of the story, then after we get through the Endeavor arc, then we'll just wrap things up with the movies, and from there everything else will all be caught up, as we will have caught up on everything up until now, and there won't be anything left to do until season 6 comes out sometime next year. So as we're approaching the catch-up point for this series, I do want to say thank you to everyone who supports Power Core Productions and Podcastings. Cannot do it without you guys. You make the channel grow, you make the core grow, as we are on the road to 2K and beyond. But anyway, without further ado, we're going to get into today's video. So as always, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. With the fall semester now coming into view, UA and its staff was now stepping up in its training, as now the new threat of unforeseen villains was on the horizon. Even with the defeat of All For One, All Might was now preparing for his retirement, and as such, a new line of defense would be needed. As Endeavor took the role of being the #1 hero, now engaging in his investigation with the second-ranked hero, Hawks, as they would look into the attacks of the Nomu and the League of Villains, as well as keeping tabs on any strange activity that could potentially involve the other Rangers. Mr. Aizawa took to upping their training. Not too long after, it would be announced that Class 1A and 1B would be joined together in a joint training exercise. Melissa would be excited, as this would be her first chance to get some real combat experience. Unlike the other Rangers though, her practical battle was going to be an exhibition more than anything else. She already had the grades to qualify for regular classes in graduation, as she was already a graduate student from Island Academy, one of the most prestigious schools in the world. With that under her belt, she didn't have to worry about academics and could mainly just focus on her hero training, which All Might was personally overseeing, as he was her guardian and uncle in a sense, as David had to return back to Island to continue his much needed research, although Island would serve as a benefactor to the Rangers and working as an ally should they ever need their assistance. As such, Melissa would get training with her quirk, elasticity, being able to extend and move her limbs as if they were made entirely of rubber. One of the added benefits of having the morphing grid unlock your recessive quirk genes. As such, whenever she wasn't doing hero training, she would mainly just work inside of the Ranger Tower in the center of UA Academy, along with Alpha, the two working on fixing the Zords and any other weapons that the Rangers might need for combat. In the meantime though, Classes 1A and 1B would be joined together for the special training session. As such, they would be divided into teams, with the main goal being on both sides to either incapacitate or capture the opponents and put them in a stowaway jail safely, and whoever was able to capture the most of the other side's group within a certain time frame would win. Among the students, excluding Melissa, there were 20 on each side. However, a new student would be attending as well, his name being Shinzo. Shinzo hadn't been seen for a while now, and it was a big surprise for everyone involved. However, he would not be participating for too long, as he, along with Melissa, would be competing in the exhibition. This would give Shinzo a chance to show off his abilities, as he had gotten some new tricks and techniques along the way, including using a binding cloth, similar to what Mr. Aizawa used in combat. They also got a chance to see how he was able to not only use his own voice for his brainwashing quirk, but that he could also mimic the voices of others, showing just how deadly he could be. After the exhibition match, the main battles would get underway. However, the students were divided in a rather odd way, as some teams had more than others. The first 3 rounds would go about as standard as you would expect. Class 1A would win the first round, with 1B winning the second, and the third ending in a tie. However, eventually it came time for the final round, which would be round 4. Izuku would notice that for the final members of the Class 1A team, including himself, it were all of the other Rangers, that being Bakugo, Todoroki, Ida, Uraraka, and Momo. They would all be taken into a van by Mr. Aizawa, as he had to drive them to where the final round would be held. The Rangers would be a bit confused, as they didn't understand why they wouldn't be competing in the regular training area with everyone else. However, Mr. Aizawa had his reasonings. No. The reason that I'm taking you to a new area is that where you're going to be competing, a lot of damage could potentially go down, and we don't want anyone else getting caught in the crossfire. But what kind of training could we be doing that could cause that much damage? Uraraka would ask. Well, as I'm sure you're aware, my morpher is based off of a legendary warrior known as Ninjor. However, all the same, I can't be a ranger full time. I'm a teacher, and I also have other responsibilities. However, with that being said, we've recently been tapping into the morphing grid, and as such, we have discovered a new set of powers. However, all the same though, we have decided that we would put together our own team of Rangers to help you in this fight. We have to assume that Lord Draken can attack at any time. Not just Lord Draken, but the League of Villains are also out there as well. Outside of the Time Force Rangers, we don't know if we would ever get any backup in the worst case scenario. So we have to be fully prepared in case of there is an attack, whether it be from within our own world or from another dimension altogether. Wow. So you're saying that there's going to be another team of Rangers like us? Deku would ask. This does make the logical sense though. But who exactly would you be taking, Sensei? Ida would ask fervorously. I think it's fairly obvious, but we've decided to go with 6 students from Class 1B. Those extras? Bakugo would chime in. Why are you even wasting your time with them? We're more than strong enough. After all, we defeated All for One. Actually, you all combined to just barely defeat All for One. You still needed All Might's help and the help of the other heroes. And based off of the data that we've been given from Alpha, we have reason to assume that Lord Dragon at the very least is that level of power, if not maybe even more. All the same, this is merely just a test to see what you guys are capable of. Me and Vlad are going to be watching from a distance, along with a few other pro heroes who will be on standby in case anything goes too far. So, what exactly is our goal here, sir? Momo would yell as well. Well, the main goal is to see how the Ranger powers work and operate. We could do the standard capture like all of the other matches up until now, but I feel like the effort that it would take to capture any one of you would be far too great. So we've decided that the final round will be a free-for-all. You will go up against the members of Class 1B who have been given their powers. The main goal is to see how you are adept at using your powers. The last team that has members standing after all the other ones have been defeated will be the winner. So it's a fight to the end. I can get behind that. But still though, we'll need to be prepared at all times. If the 6 we're fighting have been chosen to be Rangers, then it's obvious that whoever they are, they must be pretty deadly. Shut it, Icy Hot. We don't have anything to worry about. Ain't no way in hell we're gonna lose to these bozos. Mr. Aizawa would eventually arrive to the area, the van opening as all 6 would exit out. Mr. Aizawa would give them a final vote of confidence before telling them to go beyond, plus ultra. Before eventually he would drive away. Now leaving the 6 by themselves, they would see the training area they were at was much larger than the ones that the other students had to fight in. It was almost 4 times the size. They had been told that everyone else would be watching safely closer to the school campus on large monitors, and that everyone was going to be evaluating their fight, and to make sure that they did their best. As the team walked through the industrial area, they would soon hear muffling coming from above them, as they looked up to see that the enemy was now closing in. So, it seems you finally decided to show up. Some nerve, you Class 1A wannabes. Keeping us waiting like that? Don't you have any shame? I recognize that voice, Bakugo would grumble. It can't be. That's right. I, Neto Monoma, at your service. Now that the playing field's been even, it's time to see who's really the best. Although we already know the answer. There's no way you Class 1A chumps have a chance. Everything you've been doing has just been by blind luck. After all, if we had been the ones to back up All Might, then All Might for sure wouldn't have lost his power. And you have the nerve to call yourselves heroes? You should be ashamed of yourself. Deku and Bakugo would take exception to that last comment, the two of them starting to get unnerved. I'm sorry about that, guys. He can still be a little dense. Kendo? Momo would react, seeing a fellow student who she had done her internship with now arriving, and now knowing that they would be enemies. Yes, it seems as though we all have a little darkness within ourselves. All the same though, it is good to see that this is going to be a little fun. Is that Shihai? Ida would remark. Having done his studies, he would recognize the user of the quirk Dark. Yeah, I never thought I'd get a power-up like this though. Still, goes pretty good with my quirk. Huh? It's Sin Kaibara, Deku would remark. And don't forget about me. Tetsu, huh? So he's here? Todoroki would say. Well, that's 5, but who's the 6th? Deku would look around, wondering who the 6th member could be. That'll be me. Recognizing the voice, he would turn to see it was none other than Shinzo, looking down upon him. As the groups all stood from across one another, entering into a clearing, it was obvious what was going to happen. The two sides were now going to come to blows. Now that both ranger teams had been assembled, it was now only a matter to see who was truly the best. So, they picked damn extras like you to be rangers? Then we must be more bad off than I thought, Bakugo would say, as he reached for his dino buckler to pull out his morpher, the others reaching to do the same. As Monoma and the others would have their morphers made to be wrist watches, so to speak, as they would all extend their hands towards their right wrist. Shinzo, however, would pull out his own hand morpher, the one that he had been gifted by Mr. Aizawa, with the power of Ninjor at his disposal. So, the two sides will now finally meet one another. It's time to settle this once and for all. Are you guys ready? The other members of Class 1B would nod in unison, as Monoma would lead the charge. Red Ninja Power, Dragon. White Ninja Power, Firebird. Black Ninja Power, Lion. Blue Ninja Power, Unicorn. Yellow Ninja Power, Griffin. Ninja Ranger Power. Ninja Rangers, assemble. In a puff of smoke, the 6 would now transform into the Ninja Rangers. Their suits based off of that of the Ninja Alien Rangers from Aquatar. All 6 standing together, their swords now attached to their backs. It was obvious that they had been trained in the way of the shinobi, that being their form of style. In response, Deku would lead the charge with the other rangers, as the 6 would cry out their morpher. Mastodon, Pterodactyl, Saber-toothed Tiger, Triceratops, Tyrannosaurus, Dragon Zord. In an instant flash, the mighty Morphin Rangers had now appeared, the two sides eyeing each other and staring each other down, as the brief silence would fall upon both of them. The teachers looking on in anguish, the other students watching in anticipation. All Might also paying fervent attention as to what was happening. Alpha and Melissa were on standby at the communication tower, making sure that they recorded all of the data that would be gathered from this fight. As both teams revved themselves up, it was now time for the 4th and final match to begin. Bakugo would kick things off, blasting himself into the air with his explosions, as he went and set his sights straight upon Monoma, the two Red Rangers now clashing for the first time. Kendo would enlarge her fist as she went to swipe towards Momo, Momo using the stealthiness of the saber-toothed tiger and the agile features in order to dodge swiftly. However, even still, she could see firsthand just how much more experienced Kendo was when it came to hand-to-hand combat. Even with her creation quirk, she was able to create hand shields in order to block and defend herself, but she could feel the force intensified behind the punches. Ida would then kick into using his engines, moving at blinding speeds as he would come face to face with Senkaibara, the Blue Ranger respectively. Using his quirk Great, he was able to spin and move himself around at high speeds, using himself like a human drill, rushing and moving himself straight towards Ida. It was two opposing forces running into each other at the same time. Senkaibara would use his body and spin it in the reverse fashion, using it to counter Ida as Ida would run one particular style. The two blue forces moving across at one another at blinding speeds as well. Todoroki would take the fighting against Tetsu Tetsu. Tetsu Tetsu using his quirk Steel underneath his ranger uniform, making himself virtually impenetrable. And with the ranger suit adding an extra layer of protection, he was able to withstand Todoroki's fire and ice, allowing him to push through and get in for close range combat, something that Todoroki himself wasn't completely comfortable with. Even though he had a melee weapon in the battle axe, he always preferred to use his fire and ice from a distance, and whenever possible, he used his axe in gun mode, as the gun mode was able to shoot off torrents of ice with ease. In the meantime, Uraraka would take the fighting with Shihai. Using her pterodactyl abilities, she would fly across the above area, hoping to find and locate wherever he was. However, the Black Ninja was able to move effortlessly through the shadows, with maybe even more speed than he could originally. And in doing so, he made sure that wherever Uraraka went, it would be in the shaded area where he would have the advantage. As everyone had broken off into their individual fights, this now only left two remaining at the original spot: Deku and Shinzo. The two of them now coming face to face for the first time since the sports festival. Even in his morphed form, Shinzo still had the binding cloth at his disposal, an added feature that he had taken from Mr. Aizawa and incorporated for himself, as well as using his own custom sword. Deku would pull out the dragon dagger, the two sizing each other up before they would prepare for combat. You know how my quirk works. I don't need to tell you that, Izuku. However, the one thing you should be aware of though is that we're all wearing helmets in this particular moment. So, you be wise to who you respond to. Otherwise, you just might get taken out before we even begin. Deku wouldn't say a word, knowing fully well that he couldn't afford to respond. As the two would begin their own clash, the monitors would light up in bright colors as the Rangers did battle all across the different areas. Bakugo would be using his explosive power sword, slashing away at Monoma, and Monoma, who had now taken to copying a few of his friend's quirks, was now using them to his fullest extent in order to counter Bakugo. Whenever Bakugo got too close, attempting to go in for a devastating strike, he would use Tetsu Tetsu's quirk Steel, hardening himself in order to tank any attack that came his way. And in response, he would use Kendo's quirk, Big Fist, as a way to do more damage to Bakugo in the long run. Of course, he couldn't use all of the quirks at once, but in combination with his ninja abilities, he was able to time his tricks a lot flawlessly. Class 1B had been going through the ringer in terms of their ranger training. When it was decided by Principal Nezu that Class 1B was going to be given the powers, and that 6 would be chosen, even for better or for worse, Monoma proved to be more than capable of being a ranger. It was just his ego that needed to be adjusted a bit. However, all the same, Class 1B had their strategy set in motion, to separate the students as far as possible, and to put themselves in situations where they would hold the advantage, each one fighting in an area that was conducive to their abilities. For Kendo, she took to fighting Yaoyorozu in an open and more spacious field of the battle arena, doing so in a way that would keep her from getting any cover. Kendo knew that she couldn't afford to let Momo develop any sort of plan, as she was good at strategizing, and in doing so, keeping her farther away from the others meant that she couldn't get herself well coordinated, and when she was flustered, she got sloppy. For Senkaibara, he knew that in terms of speed, he couldn't spin his body faster than Ida could. However, he knew if he fought in a more enclosed space, Ida wouldn't be able to build traction and run around as freely, whereas he, using his spinning ability, was able to bounce and jump around from surface to first surface with ease. In doing so, he was able to move around and get to Ida's blind spots quicker than Ida could counter, and in doing so, it gave him the upper hand when it came to her striking. For Shihai, he knew that hiding in the shadow would be his best chance of victory, and he knew that for Uraraka, if she wanted any chance of winning, she would have to come into the darker areas of the arena. However, in doing so, it set herself up for failure, as every time she attempted to get closer into the darkness, she would be caught in the shadows of the Black Ninja, who would strike her using his power sword. Moving rather quickly, Uraraka was unable to counter even with her power bow, as she couldn't get a clear shot. Every time she attempted to use the attack, he would simply vanish into the shadows, moving at speeds that she simply couldn't keep up with. For Tetsu, his main focus was overpowering Todoroki. No matter if it were fire or ice, he knew that with his enhanced abilities now, he could tank any attack that came his way. As such, he basically was the bulldozer of all ninja, allowing himself to burrow through any attack that Todoroki sent at him, getting in for close-range combat as that was his specialty, forcing Todoroki to retreat more and more each time, as he was able to absorb the heat and the cold all at once. In the meantime, Deku would begin jumping from building to building, as Shinzo would swing using the binding cloth. The two of them fighting a bit all over, sometimes in the sky and sometimes on the ground. Even though Deku had gotten used to using his green flame, using it similarly to how Bakugo used his explosions to jet around in the air, creating flames at the soles of his feet, he was able to shoot himself and fly around in the sky, although not as gracefully. He had tried some tricks he had seen from Endeavor, from what he could see what he did on TV. However, he never fully got a full understanding of it. He would ask Todoroki from time to time if he had any suggestions, but Todoroki only had flames on one half of his body, so the idea of flying for him just was never really an option. Meaning that if Deku wanted to learn more, he probably would have to learn something from Endeavor one of these days anyway. However, he did take what he could learn, and he was able to maneuver just enough to keep pace, as the Ninja Ranger and the Green Ranger did battle. As the fights were raging on though, Deku could see that his team were struggling on all ends. Bakugo was losing his cool and wasn't staying entirely focused. Monoma had then used his own distractions and able to get a few more quirks for his disposal. Of course, he could only copy up to 3, and he could only use them for a short period of time. However, all the same, he was quite dangerous when he knew how to time his quirks flawlessly. There was a bit of a pause for concern though, when he attempted to copy one of Deku's quirks earlier in the fight. Deku was only worried for Monoma's safety, believing that if he copied one for all, he could potentially lose all of his limbs as they might blow off. However, thankfully, even when he did so, nothing truly happened, and in the end, he only ended up copying his fire quirk, which, while it wasn't helpful, didn't do too much damage in the grand scheme of things. It was Monoma's big mouth that was the main issue when it came to this fight, for both Bakugo and for Deku. Monoma was willing to do whatever it took to win, and it didn't matter how low he had to go in order to do so, as he would even go as far as to bring up their own failures. All of Class 1A were taken aback by his words, as he would bring up constantly that if they had done better in their fight against All for One, then maybe All Might wouldn't have had to retire. This hurt all of them to an extent, as everyone looked up to All Might, and no one truly wanted him to have lost his powers. They knew fully well everything that was at stake, but even still, it did bother some of them. However, none more so than Bakugo and Deku. For Bakugo, if Melissa hadn't been kidnapped in the first place, if he could have saved her at the camp, then maybe they wouldn't have been in that situation to begin with. And for Deku, what if he had been better? Was there something more that he could have done? He wasn't entirely sure himself, but the idea never left his mind. Eventually, in the midst of everything that happened around him, Shinzo had caught him in one of his traps. Using the binding cloth, he attempted to rip down a few of the larger pipes in order to fall on Deku and crush him, or at least crush him enough so that he would be immobilized. However, with all of the anger, with all of the emotion welling up inside of him, it triggered a strange phenomena inside of his body. Almost with this no way of truly knowing how he did it, he would start to manifest another quirk. He could feel it from the left side of his arm. Black whips would start to shoot out from around him, grabbing the debris that was about to fall and crush him, whipping it out of the way as larger black whip tendrils would start to form and swirl all around them, shaking and devastating the entire area. Everyone would stop in their fights to see what was happening, and out of concern, they temporarily paused to find out what had happened to Deku, only to see that he was being overwhelmed by something. No one knew what was going on and no one knew how to stop it. The teachers weren't at all understanding of what had happened to Deku either. All Might had known that for some time Deku had been dealing with a strange side effect to One for All. Deku had told this to the other Rangers as well, explaining that he had been having dreams where he would see memories or even vestiges of the previous users. He would even tell them of the one scene he saw where All for One had first given the quirk One for All to his brother, and how the power had stockpiled over the years up until now. But even still, they never thought that anything like that would lead to something like this. Deku had never shown any ability to use this quirk before, so how was he able to do so now? Everyone would gather around him trying to figure out what they should do. For Deku's team, they mainly focused on trying to get him under control. Uraraka being the first to fly over as quickly as she could, using her pterodactyl wings. She would reach out to Deku, making herself weightless to move even faster, grabbing hold of him and getting him to calm down. Deku looked at her, trying to tell everyone else to get away, but they refused to leave, knowing fully that they needed to help their friend more than anything. Even Monoma was taken aback by this. As much as he wanted to keep the fight going, he knew full well that it was best to wait. Uraraka would look over to Shinzo, asking for him to use his quirk to get Deku to try to calm down. Deku would just faintly be able to respond, and in doing so, his mind would go completely blank. He would find himself back in the void where the other vestiges of One for All were. As he did so, he would find himself meeting someone who he thought up until now were just a silhouette. It would be a larger, bald-headed man, who would yell at him to get his head back into the game. The man would explain that he were one of the previous users of One for All, and he would take note that Deku was using his quirk, Black Whip. Now knowing that he wasn't just speaking to some ghost, but that it was some spirit that was tangible within the power, the man would introduce and explain the abilities of the quirk factor, noting that every user that passed down One for All also left a bit of themselves inside of the quirk, but that now the quirk's power was cultivating and growing, and to the point now where it was starting to overflow tremendously. He would explain to Deku that the key to unlocking this power was to have a control, not just over your emotions, but also of your own power, noting that Deku was letting his anger control him in that instance, and as such, Black Whip was moving around uncontrollably. He had to be able to get a hold of it, learn how to use his anger and emotions in the right way. and in doing so, he could truly become strong. And to remember that he wasn't doing this on his own. If he ever needed help, the other vestiges were more than willing to give it to him. Not just them, but he had his friends as well. Now taking that to heart though, the image would start to fade once again, as the Black Whips would start to recede back within himself. Uraraka would slap him across the head to wake him back up, being thankful as the two of them would float back down, his team happy to see that he was alright. However, they wouldn't be celebrating for too long, as from out of nowhere a red blur would show up next to them, Monoma using an explosion quirk that he had taken from Bakugo. He would blast the both of them in the face, knocking them on the ground. Bakugo would come jetting in not too long after, and the two of them would clash swords once more. As both sides would continue on in the fight, neither one giving up an inch at all. It soon became obvious that, for all of their training, they seemed to be pretty even in the grand scheme of things. And, for the quick worry that the teachers had been given, All Might especially, as he was more than worried for Izuku's safety, as well as the safety of the other students. The two sides would then regroup, now seeing as it might be time to take the fight to the next level. Of course, the teachers never said that they couldn't go that far, so maybe now was the time. The Ninja Rangers would then all stand as one, as they would use and send their hands out into the sky. They would then summon their own Zords. For Kendo, she summoned the Firebird Zord. For Monoma, he summoned the Red Dragon Zord. For Shihai, he summoned the Black Lion Zord. For Senkaibara, he summoned the Blue Unicorn Zord. And for Tetsu, he summoned the Yellow Griffin Zord. All five coming together as one to form the Thunder Zord. The Thunder Shogun. As Shinzo would also take to forming his own Zord as well. He would transform into his armored ninja state before growing in size, and then transforming into his Shogun Battle Zord. The other Rangers now looking on to see that the Zords were now being brought into the mix. They knew they had no choice but to summon theirs as well. They would summon the Mastodon, the Pterodactyl, the Tyrannosaurus, the Saber-toothed Tiger, and the Triceratops to form the Megazord, while Deku would call upon the Dragon Zord with his Dragon Flute before entering into the fray as well. Now with the Thunder Zord as well as the Megazord, the two decided that they would take each other on, leaving Shinzo and the Shogun Ninja Zord to take on the mighty metallical kaiju, the Dragon Zord. As the Zord battle would now commence, the teachers were now more than concerned for this fight. They understood that these kids had more power than the average hero, but even still, using giant mechs seemed to be a bit much in this moment. Mr. Aizawa even had to admit that he probably should have clarified for them not to use their Zords this time around. Although thankfully they were far enough so that no one else would get hurt, although whatever damage was going to be done was going to be more than what they had bargained for in this instance. The four Zords would all clash with one another in battle. Deku using the dragon's tail, he would attempt to slash and drill away at the Shogun Zord. Shinzo, using whatever he had learned in his short time in piloting class, was able to operate just enough to use the sword to be able to counteract the dragon's tail. Meanwhile, the 5v5 was commencing, as the 5 Rangers in the Megazord combated against the 5 Ninja Rangers in the Thunder Zord, the two sides coming to blows with one another. It was made fully aware for all of them that eventually something was going to have to give. They were going to have to go all out if they wanted to win this encounter. Kendo warned that they shouldn't use that configuration just yet, as it was something that was still being tested and they hadn't even gone through the proper protocol. However, Monoma was desperate for the win, and he commanded Shinzo to join them. In something that had never been done, Shinzo's Zord would start to break away into pieces of armor, attaching and forming itself around the Thunder Zord to create Thunder Zord Shogun armor, now enhancing them and giving them a leg up in their fight against the Megazord. Deku could see what was happening and he knew that he needed to get into the fray as best he could, but he wondered what he could do. The Dragon Zord didn't have a configuration that would just allow itself to just break away into pieces. At least they didn't have that configuration at the moment. However, there was one that they could use. As the Megazord was taking a beating, Deku would tell them all to break away as soon as possible. The group would do so, as Deku would tell Bakugo to buy them some time in the Tyrannosaurus. While the Tyrannosaurus wasn't as big as the Thunder Shogun Zord, he used it in order to buy them some time. He and Uraraka and the Pterodactyl, creating distractions just long enough for Deku to create the new configurations. Along with the saber-toothed tiger, as well as the Triceratops and the Mastodon, there was one configuration that they had as their options. They would begin the transformation immediately before entering into Dragon Megazord in battle mode, with the saber-toothed tiger and the Triceratops acting as the legs. The Dragon Zord would then take a much more larger approach, with the Mastodon serving as the arms. With the Tyrannosaurus and the Pterodactyl now by its side, Deku would then take a hold of the Dragon Staff, as now, Dragon Zord in battle mode against Thunder Zord Shogun mode would now enter into its climactic final stage. As the two sides would enter into their epic clash, Mr. Aizawa along with the other teachers and staff would come over the comms, telling them that now was the time to pull out and that there was no need to go this far. However, the two sides would brush them off in this one moment. As much as the others in Class 1B didn't want to admit it, they wanted to win this fight as much as anyone else. And Class 1A was more than determined to come out on top. As much as they respected one another as heroes, in the end, this was a fight to see who was the best Ranger team. And after one final explosion, everything faded into black, with only one Megazord left standing. As one fell to the ground, the other would lift its hand in victory, and that hand would be the hand of the Dragon Megazord. Eventually, other battle drones as well as helpful construction robots that had been built by Class 1A would come onto the field to help get the Megazords back to the storage hangar underneath UA High, so that they could be properly rebuilt as well as fixed from any damage they had taken in the battle. Everyone would be gathered together as Mr. Aizawa, along with Vlad, would go over how they performed. Deku would remark that despite the help that everyone else had given him, he knew that there were still areas where he needed to improve. There was also that new power. Wherever it was or wherever it had come from, it was something that he couldn't entirely understand, but it was one that he needed to get control over. Mr. Aizawa would commend all of his students, stating that he was proud of the way they had all fought. Even Shinzo, for being new and inexperienced, he was still proud to see how he was able to handle himself in that moment. And as such, Shinzo was allowed to move into Class 1B. After all, he was their 6th Ranger, and he needed to get his training in with the others, not only to improve in his Ranger powers, but to improve on his quirk as well. With the battles now over, Class 1A would take the victory in the joint training session, with everyone happy now to see that the fighting had now come to an end, Soon, winter would come around for the country of Japan, as Christmas was just around the corner. There was also another concern that had been taking place as well. Eri, who was now being looked after by UA, more specifically by Mr. Aizawa, along with Izuku and with Mirio, who would help out whenever they could. They would also get help in terms of trying to control her quirk. Even Monoma was brought in an attempt to see if he could potentially learn how to use her power and teach her how to do so as well, as her horn was starting to grow once again. However, Monoma would explain that he was unable to do so as her quirk was a blank, basically a stockpiler quirk, and as such, he couldn't really use very much of it except for the base power. But without the fuel, the base power was pretty much worthless, allowing for it to explain now to Izuku why he couldn't copy One for All. All the better though, as if he had been able to, he probably would have lost his arms and legs in the process. Around the same time though, Bakugo and Todoroki had finally gotten their provisional license as well, and everyone threw a small party to celebrate before the holidays came around and UA would be closed for winter break. In doing so, it gave Class 1A and 1B the chance to finally mingle and relax together, as a large Christmas party would be thrown. All of the students would be gathered together and get into the festivities, even Bakugo, who didn't really want to be involved in the first place. Eri would even stop by to pay them a visit as well, as Mr. Aizawa would pass on the news to all of the students that the work studies program would be starting up again right after the break, and that they should start thinking of what agencies they should want to work with, as these work studies were now going to be mandatory. As now, with the threat of the League of Villains, as well as other foes lurking in the darkness, it was now time for the heroes to take the next step in their training. And as such, the time for the training wheels, well, they were coming off. However, all the same though, everyone did look to the future with optimism, now knowing that they were now moving one step closer in their goals to becoming heroes. Eventually, the festivities and the party would all die down. Everything would be cleaned up and time to move on ahead into the next phase of their careers was now starting to take shape, as Deku and Bakugo were also wrapping up in their cleaning, both remarking that they hadn't been able to join with an agency yet, as Deku wasn't able to join with Sir Night Eye's agency as they were still backed up and busy, and Best Jeanist was still out of commission at the moment for Bakugo. They didn't really know where they were going to be. However, that's when Todoroki would approach them. Not only because all three of them were rangers, but in a way, they all had quirks that were kind of similar to an extent. And he had already made up his mind of who he was going to be training with for his work studies. And as such, he extended the offer to them as well. And that offer was to join him in his work studies and have all three of them train under the new #1 hero, his father, Endeavor. This concludes What If Deku Was a Power Ranger? Heroes of the Morphing Grid Part 11. As always, if you enjoyed today's video and other content that we have on the channel, then don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can always stay up to date on everything that is Power Core Productions in podcastings. Stay tuned for next week as we'll be getting into more content and we'll be getting into the debut of some new series that you might be interested in as well. So always watch that community tab like a hawk, because you never know when content's going to be uploaded now or in the future. But anyway, that's going to do it for the end of today's video. I'm Javon Harrington with Power Core Productions and Podcastings. Signing off, and I'll see you next time.